Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this ThreadRipper video we're going to be discussing the Ryzen ThreadRipper reviews. So I will actually be getting my own ThreadRipper over the next week or two. I'm actually waiting for samples from a AOB partner. I can't reveal who yet, because obviously they probably want to keep that stuff private because it's their marketing. But until then, I have decided to discuss other people's reviews because a number of people have been messaging me asking my opinions on the performance, so we'll get into that in a second. But first of all, we'll be starting things off with RX Vega because it just so happens that some information regarding Vega, including performance and yet some updated pricing, has also surfaced on the same day. So we're going to get that stuff over and done with because it's much faster to cover. So, this information comes to us from videocards.com because we're going to start out with the pricing first. Now, this information is rather alarming, but it has not been confirmed by AMD. However, according to videocards.com, they have, and I'm going to quote this verbatim, but we have at least 4 independent sources claiming that there is little to no difference for the price of black and limited editions of Vega. And accordingly, and once again, this is a quote, it appears that AMD is trying to sell both blower type cards for the same price, which is $600 US. I won't read out the prices because you can, all the prices anyway, because I'll put them on screen, but you can see essentially what we're looking at here. The RX Vega 64 Black official price, of course, is supposed to be $500 US, but it is on quite a few websites, according to this, at least $650 US, and it's the same for the limited pricing, which is very weird considering the RRP of the RX Vega 64, I'm sorry, the MSRP is supposed to be $600 US, so it's not that much difference between that and the standard black edition, and the liquid is even more expensive. They've basically plonked an extra $60. And one can also see the same for Great British Pounds as well. It's pretty bloody expensive, essentially. And obviously you can check out a couple of their sources if you so desire. So my opinion on this is probably what they're suggesting. It's basically the fact that, well, pre-orders. I'm going to assume there's going to be a shortages, A, of these cards, and B, I think retailers are predicting that miners are just going to snap them up. So, obviously, I'm not going to tell you not to buy RX Vega. I would never tell you to buy or not buy anything. I would give you a suggestion, and that is that if this is kind of bringing a tear to your eye and thinking, ow, I'm not so much sure I want to pay that, I would just suggest waiting for a little bit. I mean, it's not going to kill you to wait a week or two. Sure, they might be short of being able to actually purchase the damn things, but hey, at least you'll be able to possibly get them at the RRP in theory. And perhaps most crucially of all, some Vega 64 samples have been shipped to some reviewers and a few 3D Mark scores have appeared. I don't particularly have the greatest trust for 3D Mark because it's not necessarily representative of course, the final performance in games, but it at least gives you some insight. And what do we have? Well, I'll plop once again videocards.com on screen. You can essentially see what we're looking at here. For those thinking that a driver update was going to ruffle stomp the GTX 1080 Ti, no. What we do have is a card which slightly outpaces a GTX 1080, some of the custom variants. So, for the sake of argument, we'll start with firestrike, with standard firestrike. You've got RX Vega 64, that's with 1630 MHz with 945 on the memory clock, and that is with about 22,600, whereas on the other hand, a 1080 gets 22,000, well, 600. You get where I'm going with this? Compare that to just over, well, just under 29,500 for the GTX 1080 Ti, and we can start seeing how things become quite weird. And this is the story for a lot of other cards as well. Perhaps the biggest gulf, if you want to call it that, is the scores between Firestrike Ultra and the 1080 with Vega. But even then, and it's also worth noting that unfortunately 3D Mark is only reporting the peak clock speed. So it doesn't necessarily track the clock speed as an average for A, and for B, we also don't know what the overclock speed is. So because of that, it makes it a little bit trickier to tell us whether this is actually indicative of like a stock performance. So in other words, if you were to just mosey on down to your local retailer or buy it off of Amazon or wherever you happen to buy it, throw it into your machine, is this indicative of that type of performance? Unfortunately, we just don't know. So, unfortunately for those who are really banking on RX Vega, and I know a lot of people do have FreeSync monitors, which are pretty nice, like 1440p, and are pretty much in a rock and a hard place, because obviously, if Vega is quite expensive, I mean, if these prices at launch are, true, and we see those being inflated by mining, it's going to be really tricky for people to say, hey, I want to buy this card. And it's quite weird, because I'm actually advising a couple of people right now, actually people I know in real life, between a 1080, a Vega card, and a couple of other options, like should they wait, should they go with this, should they go with that. And because obviously they want fast refresh rate screens, ideally like G-Sync or FreeSync, obviously Nvidia are considerably more expensive when it comes to G-Sync, so it's probably swings and roundabouts. So I would, unfortunately, given this information, I would just suggest waiting. But obviously, it's down to you and your particular setup, your price, how much money you're willing to cough up, that type of thing. But anyway, let's get to ThreadRipper itself. I'm actually going to be covering the technology behind ThreadRipper in a video in a couple of days, I imagine. I'm going to aim for tomorrow, but it probably will slip to the day after, because I have a couple of reviews that I'm working on for a Ryzen motherboard and some other bits and bobs, so I'll try to get to it when I can. But what I do want to discuss is, first of all, before we jump into the performance, there are a couple of things you should be aware of. So, this may put some people off, it might actually really excite other people. It depends on your, I guess, your love of tweaking and messing around with things. So, essentially, there are two modes with ThreadRipper. The first is game mode, and the second is creator mode. What these do is radically change the difference on how... Oh, and by the way, there are also some memory modes as well, which I'll get into in a moment. But these two modes, the game mode and creator mode, are pretty much what they say on the tin. What they do, one is aimed primarily at pushing the performance of gaming, the other one is more for content creators. How it does this is, with creator mode, you have access to all of the threads and bandwidth. Game mode is a bit different. It focuses on compatibility, so some games don't particularly like when you have a whole bunch on processor cores. They can be a bit weirded out. And so what it does is that it disables SMT, simultaneous multi-threading, so you no longer have, let's say, 32 threads. You would only have 16 threads, of course, if you have the 1950X. And it also does its damnedest to make sure that data and core-to-core latency are minimized. Now, how it does this, in a very brief way, is it tries to keep things within the same Zeppelin die. So in other words, it won't be pushing things across from one set of cores to another set of cores. And once again, in theory, this does improve performance. Now, what this, of course, is definitely worth noting is that if you are someone who regularly goes between gaming and content creation, then you've got a couple of choices. You can either keep rebooting and changing this, because you can't just switch it in Windows and not need to reboot. And the second, well, there's that. And the second is that, well, if you are doing gaming and you're kind of thinking, hey, I want to do this, well, you've got the choice of either doing that, or you could just pretty much just live with subpar performance on either game mode or content creator mode. Now, that doesn't mean that game mode is penalized to the point where it's pointless. So I'll put some slides on those in a moment. But, you know, it's within several frames per second. Obviously, it does depend on the frame rate to begin with and the game itself, how multi-threaded it is, blah, 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 blah. So, the other thing we need to be aware of is UMA and NUMA. There are several different memory modes, if you will, which are available, and these are essentially known as memory access modes. Now, the reason behind those is because Ryzen ThreadRipper is not natively quad-core. So, and I don't like to use the term, but I'm going to have to, just for simplicity's sake. Basically, ThreadRipper is basically two sets of cores which are pretty much spliced together, I guess is a better way of putting it, and then their communication is channeled through Infinity Fabric. So what you have to then do is, and you can either have distributed or local modes in BIOS, or you can do this through Ryzen Master Software. And you can also have the auto settings as well. So you have distributed mode, and distributed mode places data, and it basically tries to balance out memory transactions between all DRAM channels equally. And obviously that can benefit certain applications. For example, you can have Adobe After Effects, Blender, that type of thing. The other one is local mode, and this is, well, I guess the best way to describe it is it tries to localize memory access to channels, which are essentially, I mean, physically closest to the core. So in those situations, what you would probably have is lower latency, and yes, it probably does reduce available total bandwidth, but what this does do is improve performance with games. I'm going to give you a spoiler, so close your ears if you don't want it. Pretty much what I and a lot of people have been suspecting for some time. Game performance, Intel win. Single thread performance, Intel win. Multi-thread performance, content creation, you know, development, programming, 3D rendering, blah 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 blah. Ryzen obviously whoop the i9 7900X. So I'm going to go through a few results, starting things out with single thread performance. This is from Hardware Canucks. They have the Cinebench R15 test, everyone's favourite. You'll actually notice that the 1920X does have ever so slight advantage, which is not surprising, but it is within the margin of error. However, it does fall behind the 7900X, so you've got basically a 10-point difference between the 7900 and the 1920X in terms of single thread performance. So we're going to get into a couple of Cinebench results. Obviously, these will vary slightly depending. But, for example, their i9-7900X results are slightly below mine, as are the results for, I think, the 1600X might be slightly below mine, but that doesn't really matter, you know, it's within the margin of error. So their 1950X scores just a smidgen, a jot over 3,000 points, whereas the 1920X scores 2,418 points. And this is basically identical to what the chaps over at Anantech get, 3004 versus 2423, and you'll notice that that pretty much does stomp the i9, because the i9s get, my test was slightly over 2300 points, these guys are getting 2200 to 2300 points, so you're looking at a, you know, let's say 700 point advantage for ThreadRipper, which is pretty substantial. For 7-zip, which is obviously a pretty popular benchmark, to say the least, we're going to be focusing squarely on the combined score for a second. 67,361 for the 1950X, the 1920X, 55,428, which is pretty much on par with the i9-7900X, and also the 1950X G. Now, what G means, and their particular results, is game mode. So they have a couple of these graphs where you'll notice G performs substantially worse, or not that much worse in some graphs, than the non-game mode. So what this basically means is that if you have game mode, you can see that there is quite the gulf there, especially in combined score, between enabling and disabling game mode with your particular processor. In fact, I'll also point out Blender 2.78, another very popular benchmark. You'll notice the 1950X scores 162, which is a very bloody impressive benchmark. Actually, is even above the 7900 by about 40 points. The 7900X slightly beats the 1920X by just a few points, but it's by such a titchy margin. However, the 1950X with game mode is quite far behind. That's actually a lot of points behind the two. So what you basically get is that if you are running game mode with the 1950X, it's not actually that much difference, and obviously there is some difference, but it's not that much difference between even the Broadwell E processors. So that is definitely something to bear in mind if you are doing content creation. Using TextBot with Handbrake, this is 4K to 1080p. So they are looking at frames per second. They get almost 19 frames per second with the 1950X versus just a few point frames per second below 18 with the 7900X. So you're looking at just about a frame per second difference. Adobe Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro is actually a bit weird. A lot of the time it doesn't fully max out processor cores. That's why you're not seeing such a big gap as maybe you would expect. But in the case of the 1950X, 128 points versus 143 points. We could of course go through a whole lot more benchmarks, but I think you're starting to see where things are going with this. Okay, so what about gaming? Well, they're running with a GTX 1080 Gaming 8G. This is with AnandTech. We'll use Rise of the Tomb Raider first. And you can see that game mode definitely has quite an advantage. It's about 10 frames per second at 1080p. That is quite substantial. It's actually slightly more than 10. It's 11, but I'm just going to call it 10 to round things up. So that means you're actually behind... you're slightly in front of the 1800X, but not by much, by a few frames per second. But if you are not going to keep switching between game mode, or let's say you don't want to run it in game mode because you just don't want to do that, you're already in content creation mode, well, you're obviously going to have to pay a performance penalty, which may not be a big deal to you because obviously in most instances you're probably going to be GPU bound anyway, but it is still worth noting that. What about Grand Theft Auto? Well, once again, speaking about average frame rates on the GTX 1080 at 1080p, well, yeah. With game mode, you're looking at 83 frames per second. With non-game mode, it's 77 frames per second, so the gap isn't quite as big. However, it does fall behind the 1800X, the 1700X, and even more worryingly, the 1700. And obviously, the 6950X and so on are slightly in front of those as well. Okay, so what about Hardware Canucks? Well, unfortunately, they don't have their results thrown in with game mode and content mode. They just have those as kind of like together. But using ThreadRipper 1950X, they're getting 112 frames per second, which obviously falls behind this, well, pretty much any of Intel's processors, apart from the really old ones. Like if you would have like a pretty old processor, then obviously you would be probably slightly beating Ryzen ThreadRipper. And next up, we'll quickly discuss probably one of the more important titles that you can have for PC right now, and that is, well, when it comes to CPU testing anyway, Civilization 6, because it makes use heavily of DirectX 12. Well, I feel that the performance from TextBot really nailed this one down. You've got average frame rate and 1% min frame rate. We'll talk about average, and it's right there. It actually falls slightly behind the 1800X. I'm going to assume that their tests are not running in game mode, but it does slightly beat out Intel's competition, so that is something to bear in mind. Now, obviously, when I do get the processor, I can do a lot more testing and try out a lot of different methodologies. I probably can do some, multi-threading tests, some encoding tests while doing some, let's say, gaming, and possibly doing a few other bits and pieces to really test this out. But this does give some insight and pretty much goes in line with what I think many of us have been suspecting. The only kind of spanner in the works for me is this whole game mode and that type of thing. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to kill it for people, but it does definitely add a little bit of frustration. So I'm not saying not to buy the processor, but I'm just going to say, would it frustrate you and your workflow? If the answer is yes, then, that's just something for you to take into consideration. But if you are primarily buying this for content creation, some people buy this for gaming and also content creation. So let's say you're a gaming YouTuber, then obviously high frame rates are pretty important to you. Therefore, gaming performance as well as, let's say, content creation performance are just as important. On the other hand, if you're a developer, I'd say you're doing a lot of Blender work, and you're doing maybe some After Effects work, you get the idea by now. It's not that big of a deal for you to lose a few frames per second, probably. Obviously, if you've got a very high refresh rate monitor, then that's something for you to take into consideration. But I feel that people are probably going to get bogged down with this stuff, you know, the game performance, and really, this is not so much the point of ThreadRipper. The point of ThreadRipper is HEDT. It's for basically professional use. And what professionals would not be bloody impressed with the performance of ThreadRipper. Now, yes, granted, the 7900X doesn't get ruffle stomped, considering that it has considerably fewer threads, considerably fewer cores. It doesn't lose out that badly. You know, you would think it would be a massive difference, but it's not. It is certainly a big difference. I'm not going to say it isn't, but it's not, you know, it's getting stomped into the ground, but it is losing quite considerably in a great many tests. So other people are going to say, well, what about the 1920X? What about the 7920X or even the you know, the higher end Intel processors? And I'm not going to argue that they probably will perform better. The problem is, of course, those are more expensive, and the reason that Intel and AMD are kind of forced to compete with one another with the 7900X versus the 1950X is pretty simple. Price. They're both at $1,000 US. So my whole suggestion to you would be, if you're very unsure, wait a week or two for more reviews to come out, maybe BIOSes to settle down, and maybe to see if there's patches or maybe driver updates. You get the idea by now. Or if you're a content creator and you think, well, okay, that's my primary concern, then go ahead and buy ThreadRipper. I don't think you're going to be exactly disappointed. If you're primarily a gamer with content creation in mind, then I would probably still suggest that you either look at Intel's platform or you wait to see how the dust settles over the next couple of weeks. But honestly, I don't think you're going to be disappointed with ThreadRipper. But just bear in mind that if you are gaming, you're not really do that much Photoshop work. That maybe for example, you're the type of user who does a little bit maybe of 3D rendering. Maybe you're doing a little bit of, you know, After Effects work. Perhaps you're doing a little bit of, you know, programming, development work. Maybe a little bit HTML. So the idea of having additional cores is certainly appealing, but really, it's not mission critical. In which case, I would probably say the value, the sheer and utter brutal value of the Ryzen 7 1700 is just ridiculous. So I would say for the average individual who doesn't need this number of cores, then I would still suggest you get the Ryzen 7 1700. If you don't want that number of cores anyway and just watching this video for curiosity's sake, then I'd probably suggest you go with the 1600. I would definitely suggest you go with the 1600 over the 7600. It's really down to Intel now. If you're a high-end professional, I'm probably going to suggest you jump to ThreadRipper if that's your primary concern. If it's not, and gaming's your main thing with, you know, a little bit of 3D modeling or a bit of 3D work, then I would suggest a regular Ryzen. However, whether we're going to have to revisit those recommendations, particularly in the light of Coffee Lake, well, those are questions for another day. But hopefully you've enjoyed the video. As I said, do stick around for the actual review proper when I get my hands on one. Aside from that, there are some other bits coming up on the channel. Things are a bit slow at the moment because Amy has just buggered off to a festival, which is fine. I'll be buggering off actually on my own holiday at some point. I need to actually book it. So I'll be away from the channel for about a week, but that's not going to be for at least a month, probably more like 2. I'll be actually out of the country. So that'll be kind of cool. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. I shall see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.